Well, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Richard Blackmon, who is a clinical psychologist who's a part of the Calvary Community Church family, and was even a part of some of the team that interviewed me before I became pastor here. I remember that, Rick, very much. And I know you're in private practice. You've been doing this for almost 40 years, right?
Yes.
And I'm glad to have Rick's voice. I thought it might be good just to talk about some of the pressures in terms of anxiety and worry and fear and loneliness, the psychological, mental, emotional aspects of this, Rick. And I'm so glad you're willing to do this. I've found your advice to me in my own life, speaking to my own life from time to time, to be so helpful, and thought if we could share your voice with others, it might help them right now. So thanks for doing this.
Of course. Yes. I love it. Great.
So let's start with probably, maybe I'll explain a little bit how I feel. Maybe folks will identify with that. Every now and then, just being at home or in the evening, I just sort of hit like a lull where I'm thinking, is this really going on? How do I move forward with this? What will normal ever look like? And you hear all these different things coming. I just get into this like numbness every now and then. I could see how that could easily go deeper into fear, anxiety, or loneliness, even discouragement. What do you do with that? And how do you identify that kind of emotion?
I so relate to what you're saying. I've been saying to a couple of people here and there that I wake up in the morning and it's got a very surreal quality to me. I keep asking myself, is this really the state of the world? And, one of the things, I'm not typically like this, but it makes me pray to God for mercy of all things. Like, God, please have mercy, whether we deserve it or not, on your human beings. So I think it's unprecedented. I'm in my early 60s and I've never gone through anything remotely like this. So I very much relate to that surreal quality.
What do you think one of the first emotions with that surreal quality of life, where kind of life is on pause and it leaves us, kind of grasping to find something to hold on to? I know we've got the Lord, and I know that's important in your life, my life as well, and I don't want to diminish that. But from the emotional, psychological part of how God has made us, what do you think people run to first? Is it fear, worry, loneliness?
I've been thinking about it, and of course, in a way, I'm bouncing a little bit off of your sermon last Sunday on the difference between walking in faith and walking in fear.
Yeah.
And here's a way that I like to think about stuff. I think the main issue people are dealing with is various forms or dimensions of fear and anxiety. And if you really got me going, I would tell you there's a biology to depression, and there's also a psychology to depression that we're all susceptible to. And the psychology of depression is loss. If we feel loss, and there's plenty of biblical examples, but also personal examples, then we have all of the symptoms, at least for a time of recovery of depression. Anxiety is a little bit similar. There's a biology of anxiety that a lot of people, I think of them as in the anxiety club. That's just a place they go to easily. But not everybody is in that club. But the psychology of anxiety, in my mind, is dealing with the future and especially dealing with uncertainty. So
which we're facing right now.
It's almost like a definition for what's going on right now. Years ago, I read an article on the Christian and anxiety and what does the Bible say about anxiety. And I discovered that almost all of the biblical authors and even Jesus, when he talked about anxiety, they always looked at it as a kind of a preoccupation with the future, a worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. And of course, remember some of Jesus' comments about that. But you could look at John, you can look at Peter, you can look at the Apostle Paul, and they all have a similar idea. And it's just made me realize that tolerating and handling uncertainty, and probably Shawn, that the main, I'm thinking this because you once told me about yourself that you had a control freak side.
Yeah, I've said that for the pulpit, but that's no secret.
I know you have. That's why I know I'm not revealing anything out of turn here. But that's one of the things that people are first drawn to when they're facing uncertainty, is they want to control. And it can be, OCD kinds of control, trying to get order in order to benefit your inner sense of well-being. But that's what I find so complicated right now, is the level of uncertainty that we're having. None of us have been through anything like this. I mean, I can't tell you how many. people, are in various forms, whether they're running a business or dealing with their kids or they're homeschooling kids when they didn't normally sign up for that. There's just so much.
And no one's excluded. No one on the planet is excluded. So sometimes we go through anxiety, worry, fear, depression, any of those emotions, or even a sense of loneliness. There's someone outside of us who isn't going through that for the same reasons we're going through it. Right now, we're all in this. So what are some tools you've used in your life or you've shared with some of your
Well, and that's where I was going to go. If I think
please.
of the issue being revolving around fear and anxiety, then automatically my mind starts to think about what's in your toolkit, what's in your sort of what arrows are in your quiver for managing anxiety. And very honestly, the first thing that I think about and hope for people is, again, along the lines of what you were preaching about last week, is do people have a connection with God? I mean, the biblical answer generally to the issue of anxiety is that you're worrying in a sort of preoccupying way about the future. And instead of worrying, put the future into the hands of the one who owns the future. So that's a practical way. I'm always interested in. It's one of the reasons I became a psychologist. Is my interest in how does a Christian psychologist, your faith, offer a resource for living well in this world. And I feel like that's one of the very practical ways, is that as I contemplate not knowing what's going to happen with my business, what's going to happen with my future, what's going to happen with my relationships. I can't go to the game that I wanted to. My senior year track season is cratered now.
Right.
I mean, just countless little stories that I have been hearing, and I know that you and the people
And they're real, and they're real, and they're very deep. I think when you're talking about that, I sometimes physically, when I'm going through something I want to control and I can't let go of,
yes,
I will go to that passage in First Peter where he talks about casting our cares on him, and I will just sort of physically say, okay, it's yours again, God. I can't deal with tomorrow. I don't know tomorrow. You do. And so I think there's something that helps me when I almost physically take my hands in prayer and it's yours. I can't control it. Now,
it's a way of setting
back.
our mind on the right things, yes, to be able to do that and encourage each other to do that. And, we've continued both of our small groups with Zoom sessions from Calvary. And I find that's one of the things that we're doing, is reminding each other that that's what we can do with our anxieties. That's what we can do, particularly with the uncertainty of outcomes. We don't know when we'll be going back to work. We don't know exactly when we'll be convening again. I don't even know for sure when we're going to be back in that worship center.
I don't know either. I'm worried because they say we'll go back the way we got here, and they started with no groups of 250, then they went down to 50, then they went to 10. They say they'll release this later that way. So I don't know, but we've been doing it online so far, and people are leaning in. Can I ask you?
Could be a lot of sermons for you to be doing doing sermons for 10 people at a time, right?
Yeah, and I'll tell you this thing of speaking into a camera with nobody there. There are a few tech people, but they're behind things. I don't see them. And they're far away from me. It's been a lonely thing just to speak to a camera, because I love people. I love to shepherd people, even seeing their faces, greeting folks in the lobby. And I think a lot of us feel that cut off. Now, at first, it's kind of nice because it's almost like a little bit of an oasis. Your pace slows. But now I think we're all starting to, gear up for what's next. I think that adds to the anxiety, right? We start to get anxious about what's next. The first part of this, we're on pause.
Yes. So the next thing that I think about is, when I was trained 40 years ago, and we were taught about the best ways to deal with anxiety, the prevailing idea mentally was that you would try to engage in an inner debate with the cues that were making you feel anxious. But that has changed a little bit, and I find this idea helpful. And frankly, it comes out of my understanding of the Psalms. I think of these last few years, I've been thinking of the Psalms as sort of the emotion center of the Bible that teaches us how to deal with emotions. And another preacher, one of the other people besides you that I listen to regularly, he came up with a little idea that what the Psalms essentially teach us, and I'm thinking now especially about anxiety and fear, is that we're not supposed to suppress those emotions. And the way that this man put it was that we should own our emotions. But if you read the structure of virtually every Psalms, and did you know, Shawn, you probably do, that there's actually more painful emotion Psalms than happy Psalms. There's plenty of happy praise Psalm. I read one this morning, in fact, Psalm 46. But there's so many Psalms that are about the despair and anxiety and fear and uncertainty. So
one of my favorite things about the Psalms is it teaches us that if King David could tell God how he felt,
yes,
we tell God how we feel. And there's
yes,
something good about getting those emotions out to God,
so
telling him
to express them, to express those emotions. And I would say, and this is what's been kind of interesting about my field in psychology and in counseling, is instead of trying to debate ourselves out of our emotions, the cutting edge in the last decade has been to build internally a kind of tolerance, even for difficult emotions. And that's again where the Psalms, as you were just saying, and as I was saying before, is a good template for doing that, to be able to express. And then you notice in the middle of a lot of the Psalms, that David will start, or the psalmist will start with an emotion, a difficult emotion, and about partway through the psalm, you'll notice a turn.
Yes.
And the psalmist will start to turn and offer those emotions up to the Lord very honestly, with a very raw quality. So the idea that I've become fond of is to own, but don't enthrone your emotions.
I like that.
So to take your fears and your anxieties, and in your home and with your friends and with your children and with your spouse, to be able to own that, of course, I feel fear because I don't exactly know how this is going to turn out. I have a confidence about how it will go ultimately because of Christ, but I don't know exactly how it will turn out. There's the outcomes have still that uncertain quality, but to not enthrone it, to not let it direct my steps, to not use that the feeling that I'm expressing honestly and transparently as a directive for my life. That's kind of what I mean by not enthroning, and that'd be kind of an interesting conversation, just to think about what are the different ways that we can express ourselves, but not get carried away by our sadness, by our fear, by our anger. I mean, this in some ways applies to all of the particularly difficult emotions. And one of the things that counselors, I think Christian counselors and biblical counselors, have noticed for years, that one of the ways that you would refrain from enthroning an emotion is to bring some perspective into it. Like Paul in Philippians, he talks about loss and depression. He says, I count everything as loss in comparison with the unsurpassing value of knowing Christ. Or I've been quoting, you probably ran across this somewhere on the internet, the idea that Anne Frank was sequestered in a 6 by 10-foot room with 7 people for 761 days or 741 days, one of those. Right. And I think of that not in a way, not to minimize how it is for you or me or somebody else I know who feels quarantined and feels sort of stuck, but that adds an interesting perspective. I think, okay, so I've been quarantined for 2 to 3 weeks, and maybe this will last for some time longer, but it's quite doubtful to me that it's going to end up being 741 days or 761.
Or that I'm going to be in one room with 7 other people.
Yeah. At least I've got some rooms that I can go to, and we are still able to walk around. But just that idea of trying to bring a bigger perspective. Another way that I'll think about that is I'll think of MapQuest on your computer, how you can zoom in and zoom out. And if you take an emotion like fear or anxiety or pain, and you zoom in on it and brood about it, it fills up the screen, right? Figurative computer screen. But if I zoom out, and again, I'm not ignoring or denying or suppressing or minimizing even the emotion, but I'm able to put it in a larger perspective, which I just, that's a time-honored idea, of course, very biblical idea. And again, that's some of what I thought you were sharing even in your message last Sunday as well. So,
Yeah, I think that that's so important not to enthrone. It's so hard because
it's
often
very
when we
hard.
catch ourselves, we've already done that, right? We may have
Yes.
already begun to do that, and that frustration is what's making us aware that we're now overly anxious, worried. And for me, in the Psalms, it seems one is perspective. Even David will compare things to a pit, and it seems to give him a better perspective because he's not in that
Yes.
deep of a circumstance. He'll talk about
Mhm.
physical threats he's faced before that may be worse or tighter or more overwhelming. And then it also seems like he moves beyond perspective and he uses praise. Because for me, if I tell God how I feel and then I just tell God how great he is and I worship him, I read a psalm of worship or praise to him, or I read a song back to him or sing it, and only he can stand my singing. But if I sing it, what I find is that then I'm enthroning the Lord in my life over enthroning that emotion, like you're
Yes.
saying.
Oh, that's so
And
good, Sean.
and I
Yeah.
think it comes right from the Psalms again. David is always trying to find perspective, and then he's always trying to praise the Lord. So I'll say to some people when they tell me they're depressed, discouraged, overwhelmed, I'll say, well, then you just got to choose to praise God more. And when you choose to praise God more, proactive praise, you find that He then has lordship over that emotion more. Now, it's not easy. It's you know this too. I think everybody
Yeah.
listening knows this, that it's 3 steps forward, two
Two
steps
steps
back,
back.
three
Yep.
steps forward, 2 steps back. And I always celebrate with people those little steps forward because often they
Hmm.
can't see them in their perspective. How about the loneliness that folks are feeling? Even though they might be with family, we've got two of my daughters here, and Leslie and me, and we've pretty much been us, and we go to the grocery store, stuff like that. What do you say to people who feel lonely at this time? There may be even some widows, widowers, single folks, people who
Oh,
got
there
isolated
there are
alone.
plenty, and actually even some elderly people who, for safety reasons, my kids don't really
Yeah,
want us to be around my 94-year-old mother-in-law too much, just the worry that she would
many
catch it.
many of the Calvary folks know your mother-in-law is Yola.
Yeah,
We've had Yola
Yola,
pray,
right? Yeah.
hear her story of the time that God blessed her and got her through the Holocaust and came to the United States, came to Jesus, and went back to Germany as a missionary. And
Yes. And
they'll
and
never
she
forget
is kind of
Yola.
like you were saying about yourself. She's a very social person, so
Right.
this is a challenge for her. We finally got her onto Netflix, so she's able to watch The Crown and a few things like that. But she feeds like you do, Sean. I know that you've got that
On people.
extroverted quality too, and that'd be one of the things. It's clear to me that people who are more extroverted are going to feel this more keenly. And then introverts have been telling me that even that in some ways this is a challenging time for them because they're around people all the time, that they don't get
Ah,
some of the space needs that they
if you're
typically
with
would
your
have.
family, your spouse all the time, I
Yeah,
know I read that divorce rates last week went up in America.
I believe it. I believe it
And I
because
know in
because of
China
the
they skyrocketed because people are together. And so, in terms of the loneliness, what are some things you encourage folks? I mean, I know loneliness is people don't usually come to you and say I'm lonely, but I know some folks do go through that.
oh,
What
I
would you
think they
encourage
do
us to do?
they
What
do
are some
come in.
tools? What are some tools to
Well,
deal with loneliness?
obviously, one of the things I read somewhere on some tips for dealing with this, that that people should move their body every single day. They
Yeah,
should get outside if they're able to physically, even if it's walking alone and walking with a mask just for at least 30 minutes a day.
right.
And that people who are wrestling with loneliness in any form should, as a discipline, reach out in a way like we're doing right now. I mean, I would
Yeah,
much rather be sitting next to you in an office engaging in
right.
conversation. I so enjoy talking to you, Sean. And so this isn't quite as good as that, but I'll take it. It's sort of like my even doing some counseling sessions. I've been doing some sessions on Zoom or on FaceTime, and I would 100 times rather see the person in person, but that we can still reach out. So doing small groups, like I'm pretty sure the Calvary staff has been.
We're stirring those up. Yeah.
We get these things from Carolyn to continue our small group meetings and to do that with technology. I've actually been thinking about if this pandemic had happened 20 or 30 years ago,
I've thought about that too.
it would even be harder. I mean,
It
it's
would
so
be
hard
much
right
harder.
now, but all we would have had would have been the telephone. You
When with the small groups, you'll find it interesting that Carolyn's reported to us in these first 3 weeks of this, being quarantined
yeah.
or safe in our homes. Uh, some who met every other week are meeting every week.
Oh, that's
Some
cool.
some that have 75% attendance because people are busy doing other things or whatever. They've got like 100% attendance.
Oh,
It's people are leaning in, and we're longing for that. I think part of the loneliness that people feel, like you were just saying, you almost have to make choices to get out of that loneliness bubble. You have to take little baby steps, like take that walk for 30 minutes. Just get out of the space you're in, even if it's back and forth in your driveway, because maybe you lived in an area that's congested. And there are a lot of people, but most of us in the Calvary family live spread out, so we don't have that
There.
issue. I know
Yeah.
my son in New York has that issue of walks out and there's people all around him,
Oh,
but we
that's
don't
hard.
have that. Yeah, we don't have that. But I think the other one you said there is the idea. I've been encouraging people to tell me they're lonely. I'll say, well, why don't you each day text 3 people in your contacts or call 3 people? Just choose to do something, because I think even when I get lonely, what we tend to do is say, oh, I'll call them later. I'll call them later. I'll text her later. Then we say, oh, it's too late to call. I'll call in the morning. And then what happens is we kind of get ourselves deeper and tighter in that loneliness space. It's harder to break free. But if we take the little steps, that's critical.
Oh, Shawn, can I just underline what you just said a couple of times? In addition, I've had a bunch of people who feel lonely get in that downward spiral that you were just describing, and then it becomes nobody's calling me and
Right.
nobody's reaching out to
Right.
me, which starts to breed on itself. So to take
Yes.
that exact little step that you talked about, be the person who reaches out.
Yes.
And I have had several people take me up on that, exactly the same
Well,
recommendation that you made, and then report back to me a week or two later that they had to kind of push through. I'd call it like a brooding streak that they had, where they would
yes, that's a good
brood
one.
on.
I kind of call it sulking.
Yeah,
If I can,
that's as good a word as
you
well.
get so internally focused, and I think then we're robbed of any joy. We're robbed of just the the communication with other human beings, because we collapse, we implode on ourselves emotionally. And I think in this season of loneliness, we have to take those little steps. I think we have to intentionally figure out ways to communicate with others. And
Yeah,
also, another thing I've done at times when I've gotten lonely, not just in this season, but in the past, is if I see someone calling me, I'll think, oh, I'll call them later. And I let it go. Answer the phone. Have that
yeah.
human contact.
Which we're
You say,
so reticent to do. Shawn, you reminded me. I'm very good friends with John Ortberg,
yeah,
and one of the things I talk with John very regularly that he likes to do in a challenging circumstance is he will, and he said this so many times that I steal it from him a lot. He says, if I'm watching a movie and I'm the central character in the movie, and I go back and I watch the movie, how do I want that central character to have acted?
uh,
And what kind of character do I want to bring to the role? Again, if I'm watching that movie,
later.
and
So the idea is you're
yeah,
looking back and evaluating how you behaved in that movie.
so think about that for this crisis, for this pandemic crisis, where we're dealing with all the things that trigger stress and anxiety that you and I have been talking about these last minutes. Um, how do you want to look back on that? And I find things like that very inspiring, very motivating.
So,
So I want to be the kind of person who doesn't sulk, as you said it, or brood,
right,
as I said, but
right.
reaches out to others, who is other oriented and isn't just only caught up in my own fear and my own anxiety, but trying to tune in to the anxieties and the fears and the depression, maybe, and the sadnesses of others.
Yes.
Um, and just kind of just let that sink in for
How
people.
would that how would that look? You've been so gracious with your time. I think this is a great place for us to end with some practical thoughts for folks.
Yeah.
And that is, how would that look? Let's say I've been saying to people similar, and I think I got it from you actually, that in August, I've been saying to parents and to spouses, in August, what do you want to look back and say you went through with your kids? Did you lose your cool a lot? Did you Did you not? You pulled them into your own discouragement? And because a lot of times kids are pretty resilient, and we as parents can pull them into
We
a
might
dark
infect
world,
them with our own, yes.
with our own emotion. And kids, if we let them, can help us get out of a funk or a sulking, a loneliness, or worry and anxiety. So, what kinds of things would you suggest to, say, a spouse? What do they want to look back and see? And what do you think parents should, looking back at the movie where they're the main character in it, of this, we'll call it the pandemic movie of their life
Yeah,
this spring.
yeah, yeah.
They
The
look at
movie
it
that
this
we're all in at
fall.
the same
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
What do you think they, just take the parent and then take the spouse? What should they look back, and what would be some things you think they need to cultivate now so they can look back and see them?
That's a great question. Just trying to really make it practical. I think that I would want to look back, and I would want a parent and a spouse to look back, and maybe first of all think that I was an encourager. That instead of dragging my mate down, my spouse down, instead of dragging my child down, I was more of a replenishing force than a
Yeah.
draining force.
Yes,
And
I like that.
that's like, and when I think about that, boy, that just grabs me right in the heart. Like, I do want to be that person. That's the person that I want to be, even though I'm riddled in the same way everybody else is, with fears, with anxieties, that I want to add value. I used to have people write down on the top of a piece of paper, the word draining on one heading and replenishing on the other. And then just trying to think about people in their life who, when they were with a draining person, there was less
Which
of
have they
them.
been doing?
Pardon?
I said, which they have been doing.
Yeah,
Which
which
one?
they've been
Draining
doing.
or
Yeah,
replenish?
and you can certainly apply that to other people in your life too. But if I'm looking back, and how did I go through the pandemic? What kind of role did I play as a central character in that pandemic movie? That I was a replenishing force. I think I also would want to be somebody who is striving to think about God's goodness. And I read this morning, I wrote it down because I thought it was interesting. I knew you and I would be talking, and I hadn't seen this exact piece in First Thessalonians. Be joyful always, pray continually, giving thanks in all circumstances.
That's tough right now.
And, yeah, it's tough, but I think that's how I'd want. Like, can I still be joyful? Can I still continue to pray, turn in the direction of God instead of away from God, and give thanks? And that's another thing I would really underline in looking back is, was I a person who was able to retain gratitude and think of the things that I could be thankful for, even in the midst of, again, not pretending that there's not, in this case, pain and even death in the world, so that I was able to do that.
I think the one thought I had regarding the list you gave was, prayerful, thankful, and what was the other one? Joyful.
Joyful.
That all takes conscientious choices on our part, where we choose to do that. And that, I think, is very important as we kind of come to the conclusion of our talk. And I appreciate your time, Rick, very much.
Love it.
Again, I hope folks have gotten a sense of your heart for the Lord and for people, and making sure people in this life find hope and live well, and a sense of well-being in their lives. Your heart for that has blessed many, I know. I know folks who've gone to counseling to you, and I've found good help and counsel from you over the years. And I think, doesn't it boil down to, Rick, that it's the choices we make? Like, if we want that movie, if we want to look back and see ourselves as joyful, thankful, prayerful, as replenishers rather than drainers of others, we have to then intentionally choose today with our kids to be a replenisher of our kids, a replenisher of our spouse. We have to make those choices, and those choices get us over that hump of anxiety and worry and loneliness. It helps us. It's part of the movement in the right direction.
Which probably, just in sort of a summary statement, again points back to the need for community, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That you could say it just that way encourages me. When you were just talking, I was thinking to myself, I want to make those choices that Shawn is talking about.
Yeah.
And if I can have that effect on people, and then we can just have that effect on others. It's just part of being really a human being, and not just an animal, right? We aren't just subject to our urges and even our emotions. They are Lights on the dashboard are emotions. They tell us important and fruitful things about ourselves. But the most famous guy, who was the guy who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. Yeah. He was very, very famous for exactly what you just said, that in his case, in the midst of the Holocaust, that he understood between stimulus and response, there was always a choice, even if it was on a hair's breadth.
Yeah.
There was always, and learning to elongate. This is the way that Viktor Frankl talked about. I'll never forget that. To elongate the space between a stimulus and a response. That's the place in which we have choice.
Right.
And as you just very beautifully said, that's probably going to be our best ticket to being able to ride out this thing in a way that we can look back and then we can all kind of share war stories and foxhole stories, but feel like we honored God and honored the people in our lives and during that process.
I think that's good. I would just encourage people, as you've said, it's just tell God how you feel. It's okay to express those emotions. They're real. Own them. Don't enthrone them. I think part of that not enthroning is, like you said, perspective. Getting perspective, making sure you're proactive in your praise of God. I think that's a little bit of what Viktor Frankl said there too, is the idea that you in that space make choices that are healthy for you and others. And if you feel yourself getting a little isolated, a little lonely, a little overwhelmed, reach out to other people just to say, hi, how are you doing? How can I help you? How can I pray? And those choices of simple things like gratefulness, gratitude, the choice of being prayerful, praying for other people. This is a great time to be others oriented, even in praying for their fears and their worries. And then I really love that. When you shared that with me a few weeks ago, I asked you about how we get through this. You said that when we get to the late summer, early fall, we look back, what do we want the story to be of how we parented? How were we a friend? How were we a brother or sister in Christ? How were we a spouse during that period? I think that is very good and helpful to us to be able to know what we should be doing today. So thanks for taking the time, Rick, for this. I really appreciate it. I know you're busy and you work in between some of your appointments, and I hope you get that Wi-Fi working again. I know we didn't mention at the beginning, but you had a little struggle there because you were on your iPhone because you couldn't get your computer to quite work. But it's important. It's important in your business right now, isn't it, to be able to talk to people about?
I got to get it going for the next hour or so. That's right.
Yeah. So. Thank you so much, Rick, and you've been a blessing to me. And thanks for allowing your voice to be a blessing to others in the Calvary family. We really appreciate it. God bless you,
Shawn. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.